Welcome to Readings in English, the place where you will learn English through engaging and carefully designed stories. We all know that learning a new language, especially English, comes with its own set of challenges. Whether it's understanding unfamiliar words, mastering grammar, or building the confidence to speak, the road to fluency is full of obstacles. But here on this channel, you won't face them alone. Through our incredible and educational stories, you'll improve your English step by step in a fun and meaningful way. Today's story is about a man who faces his own set of challenges as he sets out to learn English. An older man, determined to visit his grandson in a foreign country, decides to learn the language despite his age. Along the way, he encounters difficulties, but never gives up. He finds a support group of other seniors who are also learning English, and together they form friendships, face their struggles, and prove that it's never too late to learn something new. This touching tale is about overcoming obstacles, the power of friendship, and the importance of lifelong learning. Walter sat in his living room, the walls of his small, quiet home feeling closer than ever. The sound of Jack's laughter, once a staple of the house, now felt like a distant memory. Jack, his only grandson, had moved abroad, leaving Walter with a profound sense of emptiness. Walter had watched him grow up, teaching him how to fish and telling him stories of the family's past. But now Jack was in a different world, a world where English dominated and where Walter's knowledge of his native language no longer bridged the gap. The separation was both emotional and physical, and it weighed heavily on Walter's heart. The airport scene played over in his mind, Jack waving goodbye, smiling with excitement, while Walter waved back, a smile hiding his sadness. He knew Jack had to go. His grandson had a bright future ahead of him, studying and working in a foreign country. But for Walter, that departure marked the beginning of something he hadn't expected: loneliness. A few weeks passed, and one morning, Walter found a letter in his mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable, Jack's neat, slightly slanted letters, but when he opened the envelope, he was met with a block of text that was indecipherable to him. It was all in English. Walter's heart sank. He stared at the words, feeling both frustration and isolation wash over him. The distance between him and Jack had grown even more significant. He couldn't understand the letter, couldn't grasp the thoughts and emotions Jack had tried to share. For the first time in his life, Walter felt truly old. The world was moving forward, leaving him behind. He set the letter down on the table and leaned back in his chair, a deep sigh escaping his lips. Jack was slipping away, and there was nothing Walter could do about it, or so he thought. That night, unable to sleep, Walter sat in bed thinking about Jack. His mind wandered to the memories they had shared, the fishing trips, the quiet conversations, and the laughter that had once filled his home. He realized that he couldn't just let the distance grow. He had to do something to keep the bond between them alive. But what could he do? How could he, at his age, possibly bridge the gap that language had created? Walter tossed and turned, and by the early hours of the morning, he had made a decision he would learn English. The thought both terrified and excited him. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He was no longer young, and his memory wasn't as sharp as it once was, but if learning English meant he could stay connected with Jack, it would be worth every struggle. The next day, Walter began researching English classes. It felt strange, sitting in front of his computer, a device that still baffled him at times, but he pressed on, determined. After a few hours of searching, he found what he was looking for, a local English class for seniors at the community center. Nervous but resolute, he signed up. Walter's first day at the class arrived, and he found himself surrounded by people just like him, seniors, who, for various reasons, had decided to take on the challenge of learning a new language. There was a certain camaraderie in the room, a shared understanding that none of them had expected to be sitting in a classroom at this stage of their lives. The teacher, a patient woman with a gentle smile, welcomed them all warmly, immediately putting Walter at ease. Despite the welcoming environment, Walter soon realized that learning English was going to be much harder than he had anticipated. His memory was slower, and the words didn't come as easily as they once had. He struggled with pronunciation, and even simple sentences felt like a mountain to climb. Each class left him exhausted, both mentally and physically, but Walter didn't give up. Every time he felt the weight of frustration bearing down on him, he thought of Jack. He pictured their reunion, the moment when he would finally be able to speak to his grandson in his new language. That vision kept him going. The other seniors in the class became more than just classmates, they became friends. They shared stories of their own struggles and victories, and slowly but surely Walter began to feel a sense of community. It was comforting to know that he wasn't alone in his journey. Together they celebrated each small victory, whether it was mastering a new word or understanding a simple sentence. The bond they formed transcended the classroom, spilling into their daily lives as they supported each other. Weeks passed, and one day, during a particularly challenging class, something clicked for Walter. He was handed a short paragraph in English to read aloud. His hands shook slightly as he held the paper, his eyes scanning the words. Slowly, carefully, he began to read. The words weren't perfect, and his accent was heavy, but he did it. He made it through the paragraph. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. His classmates cheered, and for the first time, a long time, Walter felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that he had almost forgotten existed. It was a small victory, but for Walter, it was monumental. That moment renewed his motivation. It wasn't just about learning English anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could still grow, still change, no matter his age. The class became more than just a place to learn, it became a place of transformation. He wasn't just learning a language, he was reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost over the years. As the chapter closed on those first few weeks, Walter's determination had only grown stronger. The road ahead was still long, and the challenges were far from over, but with each small victory, he inched closer to his goal. The weeks following Walter's small victory in class passed quickly. Each lesson presented a new challenge, but now he wasn't facing them alone. His classmates had become more than just people who shared a room with him twice a week. They had become friends. They often met outside of class to practice English together, whether it was reading short stories or simply talking over coffee. These moments helped deepen their bond, and soon Walter realized that his classmates were becoming an essential part of his journey. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging grammar lesson, Walter found himself sitting in a cafe with Joan, one of his closest friends from class. Joan was a retired teacher, and although she had spent years working with students, she admitted that learning a new language later in life was more difficult than anything she had taught. Walter appreciated Joan's honesty, and the two often exchanged stories about their frustrations and triumphs. That afternoon, Walter admitted something that had been weighing on his mind since the beginning. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Some days I feel like it's just too hard, like I'm too old to make it work." Joan smiled sympathetically and leaned forward. "We all feel that way sometimes, Walter. But you've made so much progress already. Think about where you started. You didn't know a single word of English when we first met, and now look at you. You read a full paragraph the other day. It's slow, sure, but it's progress. And that's what matters." Walter nodded, her words giving him a small boost of confidence. Still, the doubts lingered. His mind was slow to grasp the grammar rules, and his tongue struggled with the unfamiliar sounds of English pronunciation. Every class seemed to introduce something new that threw him off balance, making him question if he had the stamina to keep going. A few days later, Walter's doubts intensified during a particularly difficult lesson. The teacher introduced a new grammar rule that left him completely bewildered. As the other students seemed to grasp the concept quickly, Walter felt himself falling behind. His frustration grew, and for the first time he seriously considered quitting. The thought of walking away from the class and abandoning his goal briefly crossed his mind, and he wrestled with it for the rest of the day. That evening, Walter returned home and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the English textbook that had become his constant companion. He opened it to the page they had been studying earlier, hoping that somehow the words would make more sense now that he was alone. But the sentences were still a blur of confusion. He let out a frustrated sigh and pushed the book aside, feeling defeated. Just then the phone rang, pulling Walter from his thoughts. It was Joan checking in on him after noticing his struggle in class. Her voice was calm, reassuring, and as they talked, Walter realized that he wasn't the only one facing challenges. Joan, too, had her moments of doubt, but she reminded him that the journey wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. Her words stayed with Walter long after their conversation ended, rekindling a small spark of hope inside him. The following week, Walter returned to class with renewed determination. He still struggled, but he pushed through, relying on the support of his friends to keep him going. As the days passed, the group of seniors began meeting more frequently outside of class. They formed a small study group, gathering at each other's homes to review lessons and help one another through the tough spots. These meetings became more than just a chance to practice English. They became a source of encouragement and companionship for Walter. One evening, after a particularly productive study session, Walter sat with the group, listening as they shared their personal reasons for wanting to learn English. Some wanted to travel, others simply wanted to challenge themselves, but for Walter, it had always been about Jack. He hadn't shared much about his grandson with the group, but now, as they opened up to one another, he found himself telling them the story of why he had decided to start this journey. "I'm doing this for my grandson," Walter said, his voice soft but steady. "He moved abroad a few months ago, and I realized that if I didn't learn English, I'd lose the ability to communicate with him. That's what keeps me going. Even when it feels impossible." The group listened intently, nodding in understanding. Joan placed a reassuring hand on Walter's arm. "That's a beautiful reason, Walter, and it's clear how much you care about him. I know you'll get there." Her words filled Walter with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just learning English for himself, he was doing it for Jack, for the bond they shared. That reminder helped him push through the difficult days, and slowly but surely he began to notice small improvements in his comprehension and pronunciation. A few weeks later, the group's hard work paid off in a way that surprised even them. During one of their study sessions, they attempted to read a short story in English together. It was a simple tale, but as they took turns reading aloud, Walter realized that they were all understanding more than they had expected. The words that had once seemed so foreign were starting to make sense. The group celebrated this small victory with a sense of pride and accomplishment. It was a moment that reminded them all of how far they had come since they first started this journey together. For Walter, that night marked a turning point. His confidence grew with each passing day, and although the road ahead was still long, he now had the support of his friends and the knowledge that he wasn't walking it alone. The bond they had formed had become one of the most valuable parts of his experience. Learning English was no longer just about mastering the language, it was about the friendships he had made and the community they had built. As the chapter drew to a close, Walter found himself reflecting on his journey so far. He had started this path feeling alone and disconnected, but now he was surrounded by people who shared his struggles and celebrated his victories. The challenges were still there, but with every small success, Walter felt himself growing stronger. His goal of visiting Jack felt more achievable with each passing day, and with the support of his newfound friends, he knew that no obstacle was too great. Walter looked around at the group, their laughter filling the room, and smiled. His journey was far from over, but he was no longer walking it alone. He was part of something bigger now, and that gave him the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As Walter continued his journey of learning English, he found himself reflecting more and more on his past. One quiet afternoon, he sat in his small living room, the warm light filtering through the curtains, and memories of Jack's childhood flooded his mind. He remembered the days when Jack was just a boy running around the yard, laughing and asking endless questions. Those were simpler times when Walter felt like he was more present in Jack's life. Now, with the physical and emotional distance between them, Walter couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He had missed many moments over the years. Work, responsibilities, and the passage of time had all contributed to a growing distance that neither of them had fully realized until Jack left for another country. Walter wondered if learning English was about more than just being able to visit Jack. Perhaps, in some way, it was about redemption, about proving to himself that he could still be there for his grandson, even after all the lost time. This realization gave Walter a deeper sense of purpose, something that pushed him forward even on the days when learning English seemed impossible. The next few weeks in class were focused on preparing for an upcoming presentation. The teacher had announced that the class would be reading short stories in English in front of their peers, a daunting task for everyone. Walter felt a surge of anxiety at the thought of speaking English in front of others. It was one thing to stumble through sentences in the privacy of his home or with his friends from class, but standing up and reading in front of an audience, that was a whole different challenge. As the presentation day approached, Walter practiced as much as he could. He worked through the short story assigned to him, trying to perfect his pronunciation and understand the meaning behind each word. His friends, especially Joan, were incredibly supportive. They gathered for extra study sessions where they would read their stories aloud to each other, offering encouragement and gentle corrections. Still, despite all the practice, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't ready. The night before the presentation, Walter lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing with nerves. He had come so far since he first started learning English, but the fear of failure loomed large. What if he made a mistake? What if he froze in front of the class? The doubts swirled in his mind, making it difficult to sleep. He thought of Jack, of the letter that had prompted this entire journey, and reminded himself of why he was doing this. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about trying, about making the effort to connect with someone he loved. The day of the presentation arrived, and the classroom buzzed with nervous energy. The students sat in their chairs, fidgeting and murmuring words of encouragement to each other. Walter could feel the tension in the room. He wasn't alone in his anxiety. Everyone was feeling the same way. When it was his turn to stand in front of the class, Walter took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper with his story. The words blurred in front of him for a moment, but then he steadied himself. As he began to read, the first few sentences came out haltingly, his accent thick and his pronunciation imperfect. But with each word, Walter gained a little more confidence. The faces of his classmates, full of understanding and support, helped him push through the fear. He stumbled here and there, but he didn't stop. When he finally finished, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Walter had done it. The sense of accomplishment that filled him in that moment was unlike anything he had felt in years. His classmates, his friends, surrounded him with congratulations, and Walter couldn't help but smile. He had faced his fear and come out on the other side. It wasn't just about the presentation, it was about everything this journey had come to represent. Learning English wasn't just about visiting Jack anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could still grow, still challenge himself, no matter his age. In the days that followed, Walter felt a renewed sense of purpose. The presentation had been a turning point for him, a reminder that success wasn't about being perfect, but about making progress. His friendships with the other seniors deepened as they continued to support one another. They laughed together, shared stories, and celebrated each small victory, knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth acknowledging. One afternoon, as Walter was packing up after class, the teacher handed him an envelope. "This came for you," she said with a smile. Walter's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the handwriting on the front. It was from Jack. He hadn't expected another letter so soon. As he opened it, his eyes scanned the page, and, to his surprise, part of it was written in simple English. Jack had written to him in a way that Walter could understand, as if acknowledging the effort his grandfather was making. Walter read the letter slowly, piecing together the words he knew and finding joy in the fact that he could understand most of it without help. Jack wrote about his new life abroad, about school and the friends he was making, and at the end of the letter, there was a short message in English. "I miss you, Grandpa. Can't wait to see you." The simple sentence filled Walter with a sense of pride that brought tears to his eyes. His efforts were paying off. He was getting closer to his goal, and more importantly, he was maintaining the bond with Jack. That evening, Walter sat in his chair, reflecting on the journey so far. He had come such a long way, not just in learning a new language, but in rediscovering his purpose. He thought about all the challenges he had faced, the doubts, the setbacks, the moments of frustration, and how, through it all, he had continued to move forward. His friendships with the other seniors, the support from his teacher, and his love for Jack had carried him through. Walter knew there were still many challenges ahead. Learning English was not a linear journey, and there would be more difficult days. But now he had something stronger than fear or doubt. He had confidence. confidence in his ability to learn, to grow, and to keep going no matter what. And with each passing day, the dream of visiting Jack in his new country felt more and more real. As the chapter came to a close, Walter felt a sense of peace. He had found more than just the ability to speak a new language. He had found a community, a renewed connection with his grandson, and most importantly, a deeper connection with himself. He was no longer the man who sat alone, wondering if he could make a difference in Jack's life. He was the man who had taken on a challenge, faced it head-on, and emerged stronger for it. And that, to Walter, was the greatest victory of all. Walter's progress in learning English had been slow but steady, and with every passing day, he felt a sense of accomplishment growing inside him. The support from his classmates had become a vital part of his journey. Each week they gathered, not only to learn but to celebrate each other's small victories. The classroom had become more than just a place to study. It had become a space of friendship and mutual encouragement. Walter's goal of visiting Jack seemed more achievable with each passing day, but it wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult lesson, Walter sat down with his teacher to discuss his progress. The teacher, a kind and patient woman named Mrs. Harper, had noticed Walter's growing confidence, but also saw that he was struggling with the more advanced material. She suggested that Walter began working on more complex reading assignments, pushing him out of his comfort zone. Walter felt both excited and apprehensive. He knew that advancing meant tackling more difficult grammar and vocabulary, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for the leap. That evening, Walter took the new material home, determined to tackle it head-on. He sat at his kitchen table, the pages spread out in front of him, and began reading. The sentences were longer, the words unfamiliar, and his progress felt painstakingly slow. For hours he worked through the text, stopping frequently to look up meanings and practice pronunciation. The challenge was greater than he had anticipated, and by the time he went to bed, Walter felt drained and unsure of himself. The doubts he had fought to keep at bay began creeping back in. The following week in class, Mrs. Harper introduced new reading materials, more complex than anything the group had encountered so far. Walter could see the unease on the faces of his classmates as they opened their books, but he wasn't alone in his struggle. Joan, always sitting beside him, shared a knowing glance, her brow furrowed in concentration. Together they navigated through the difficult text, supporting each other whenever one of them stumbled. The camaraderie within the group became more important than ever. They leaned on each other, not just for academic help, but for emotional support. They were all in this together. After class, the seniors gathered in their usual spot at a small cafe down the street. The mood was quieter than usual, the weight of the new material lingering over them. Joan broke the silence with a sigh. "That was tough today," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Walter nodded in agreement, sipping his coffee. "I feel like I'm falling behind," he admitted. "Every new lesson feels harder than the last." Joan placed a comforting hand on his arm. "We'll get through it," she said with a small smile. "We always do." The group shared a few more words of encouragement before parting ways for the day. Despite the challenges, they knew they couldn't give up now. They had come too far to turn back. A few weeks later, during one of their study group sessions, Walter had a breakthrough. After struggling with a particularly difficult article for days, he finally managed to read through it without too much trouble. The words began to make sense, and the meaning of the text clicked in his mind. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to Walter. His confidence grew, and the fear that had gripped him for so long started to loosen its hold. His classmates noticed the change in him. Walter began participating more in class, answering questions, and even helping his peers with difficult words and phrases. The sense of accomplishment that came with each new skill filled him with pride. Learning English wasn't just about being able to speak with Jack anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome any obstacle, no matter how daunting it seemed. One evening, after a particularly successful study session, Walter received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Jack. He hadn't heard from his grandson in a few weeks, and the familiar handwriting brought a smile to his face. Walter sat down at his kitchen table, carefully opening the envelope. As he began to read, his heart swelled with pride. Jack had written the entire letter in English. Not just simple sentences, but full paragraphs, clearly and thoughtfully composed. Walter took his time reading the letter, savoring every word. Jack wrote about his new experiences abroad, the challenges of adjusting to a different culture, and the friends he had made along the way. At the end of the letter, there was a short message that made Walter's eyes fill with tears. "I'm so proud of you, Grandpa. I know how hard you've been working to learn English, and I can't wait for the day we can have a full conversation when you visit." The words hit Walter deeply. His efforts, all the hard work and struggles, were paying off. He was getting closer to his goal, not just of learning English, but of reconnecting with his grandson in a way that truly mattered. The pride he felt wasn't just for himself, but for the bond he was rebuilding with Jack. The next few days were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Walter threw himself into his studies with more enthusiasm than ever before. The challenges remained, but now they felt like stepping stones rather than obstacles. Each new lesson, each unfamiliar word, was a part of the journey that was bringing him closer to Jack. One afternoon during class, Mrs. Harper announced that they would be moving on to even more advanced materials. Walter could feel the tension in the room, the apprehension in his classmates, but he didn't share their hesitation. For the first time, he felt ready. He welcomed the challenge, knowing that each step forward was a victory in itself. As the weeks passed, Walter's progress became undeniable. He was no longer the hesitant student who had once doubted his ability to learn. He had grown in confidence, in skill, and in his belief in himself. His friendships with the other seniors deepened, and they continued to support each other through the difficult moments. They had become more than just a class, they had become a family. Walter's journey wasn't over, but as he sat in the classroom, surrounded by his friends, he knew that he had already achieved something far greater than he had ever imagined. Learning English had brought him closer to Jack, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose and a belief that it was never too late to grow, to change, and to connect with the people who mattered most. With each passing day, Walter felt more prepared for the moment when he would finally visit Jack. The thought of seeing his grandson again, of being able to speak to him in English, filled him with anticipation and joy. It wasn't just about the language anymore, it was about the journey, the friendships, and the discovery of his own resilience. As Walter looked around at his classmates, he realized that they had all grown together. They had faced their fears, their doubts, and their challenges, and had come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead was still long, but now Walter knew he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just learning a language, he was rediscovering himself, and that, to him, was the greatest accomplishment of all. The day had finally arrived. Walter stood in his small bedroom, looking down at the neatly packed suitcase sitting on the floor. It was surreal to think that after all the months of preparation, hard work, and emotional ups and downs, he was about to embark on the journey he had dreamt of for so long. He was going to visit Jack. The thought filled him with a mixture of excitement and nerves. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, a part of him still couldn't quite believe it. Walter moved slowly around the room, checking and rechecking that he had everything he needed. His English textbook, a small notebook filled with useful phrases, and the letters from Jack were all tucked carefully into his bag. These had been his constant companions throughout the journey, reminding him of his purpose and pushing him forward when things got difficult. But now he felt a new sense of confidence. He wasn't the same man who had started this journey months ago. He had grown not just in his ability to speak English, but in his belief in himself. The morning was crisp, and as Walter stepped outside, suitcase in hand, he took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his journey to visit Jack, but in his life as a whole. The drive to the airport passed in a blur of anticipation. Walter's thoughts kept drifting to the moment he would see Jack again. He imagined their first conversation in English, picturing Jack's surprised smile as they spoke, no longer separated by language. As Walter boarded the plane and settled into his seat, he glanced out the window, watching the landscape below shrink away. The hum of the engine and the quiet murmur of passengers around him created a calming backdrop, giving Walter time to reflect on everything that had brought him to this moment. He thought of the friends he had made in his English class, the support they had given him, and how their encouragement had carried him through even the toughest days. Saying goodbye to them had been bittersweet. They had become such a vital part of his life, and though he was excited about seeing Jack, he knew he would miss their regular gatherings. The flight was long, but Walter's mind kept him occupied. He thought of the letters from Jack, the motivation that had sparked this entire journey. He had been so afraid of losing his connection with his grandson, but now he felt closer to Jack than ever before. Learning English had been the bridge that brought them back together, but along the way, Walter had rediscovered something even more important: his sense of purpose. When the plane finally touched down, Walter's heart raced with anticipation. He made his way through the airport, the unfamiliar sounds of a foreign language swirling around him, but for the first time he wasn't intimidated. He had come too far to feel afraid now. As he walked toward the arrival's gate, his eyes scanned the crowd for a familiar face, and then there he was, Jack, standing just ahead, waiting. Walter's breath caught in his throat as he saw his grandson after so many months apart. Jack looked older, more mature, but his smile was still the same. They stood there for a moment, both taking in the significance of the moment, before Jack walked forward, wrapping his arms around his grandfather in a tight embrace. "I missed you, Grandpa," Jack said, his voice filled with warmth. Walter smiled, his heart full. "I missed you too, Jack." As they pulled apart, Jack looked at him with a grin. "You've been practicing, haven't you?" Walter nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "I have. I wanted to be ready to talk with you." Jack laughed, the sound light and joyful. "Well, you're doing great already." They sat together in a small cafe at the airport, sipping coffee and catching up on everything that had happened since Jack moved abroad. Their conversation flowed easily, the language barrier that had once felt so overwhelming now a distant memory. Walter marveled at how far he had come, how the words that had once seemed impossible now rolled off his tongue with surprising ease. As they spoke, Walter couldn't help but reflect on how much this journey had changed him. It wasn't just about learning a new language, it had been about reconnecting with his grandson, yes, but also about rediscovering parts of himself that he had forgotten. The determination, the resilience, the ability to grow and change even in the later stages of life, these were the real lessons he had learned. After they finished their coffee, Jack suggested they take a walk through the city. As they strolled down the bustling streets, Walter marveled at the vibrant energy of the place. Everything felt new and exciting, but with Jack by his side, guiding him, Walter felt more at ease than he had expected. Jack pointed out his favorite spots, sharing stories of his life in this new country, and Walter listened, his heart swelling with pride at the young man Jack had become. That evening, as they sat together in Jack's apartment, Walter felt a deep sense of contentment. He had made it. He had achieved what he once thought was impossible. But more than that, he had strengthened the bond with his grandson, a bond that he knew would only continue to grow stronger. Jack handed Walter another letter written in English, but this time they read it together, laughing at the memories it contained and sharing stories of their own. As the evening drew to a close, Walter reflected on everything that had led him to this moment. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every struggle, every moment of doubt. He thought of his friends back home, the group of seniors who had been his support system through it all, and how they had shared in his victories and setbacks. He knew that this journey wasn't just his, it belonged to all of them. Walter knew that this trip was the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his relationship with Jack, but in his own life. Learning English had opened doors for him, not just to visit his grandson, but to a new sense of purpose and a belief that it was never too late to learn, to grow, and to connect with the people who mattered most. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the city outside, Walter felt a deep sense of peace. He had achieved what he set out to do, but more importantly, he had rediscovered himself along the way. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, a long time, Walter felt ready for whatever came next. He closed his eyes, a smile on his face, and let sleep take him, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more opportunities to grow, to connect, and to live fully in this new chapter of his life.